There are different senses in which people seek to know themselves. There are different ideas about what the true self is. Of the two ways of seeing the self, one is denominated in dependently originated phenomena, and the other is what observes that. One is observable and one is what observes, but is not observable. So the true self that's not observable, but rather what observes, the realization that one is that is transformative and changes the way reality is perceived. Whereas the taking of oneself to be dependently originated phenomena separates one from that other realization, that other transformation, takes one farther into reaction to the fate of objects. Consider the scope of what's observed. All thoughts are observed, all energy is observable, but not always perceived. Delusion is when some subset of what's observed by the awareness that is the self is taken to be the self. That is the source of agitation, like an agitator in a washing machine. The belief in being I causes a fear that hides love. But when identification with the I and everything attached to it falls away, it's like the agitator is broken. The belt of belief has separated the engine from the agitator. Nothing will move anymore. There's no belief in being one to own a thing. That condition, it can't be arrived at through the pruning of the branches of thought, but rather the cutting of the root, the I, the root of the identity, the facilitator of relational thinking, that is I. People are alarmed when a fake hand positioned next to theirs is banged with a hammer. They unconsciously took that hand to be part of themselves, some kind of mirror neurons fire. The consequence that is felt is physical pain, or the consequence that's feared is physical pain. But to reach the end of suffering while the body still lives, it doesn't come from the toleration of physical pain, but an absence of emotional suffering. So of all the things that one may take oneself to be, a thing like a hand, it might not be something that is sensitive to insult, but there are other parts that take umbrage at being slighted. Parts having to do with the provenance of the body. But those observable parts are not what's observing them. If those parts weren't believed to be possessions, their fate would cause no disturbance. It would be like the fate of someone else's car. When something crashes on it, the absence of ownership or connection negates the reaction to destruction or insult. When the fate of an object no longer troubles the mind, it means the object has either lost its novelty, its utility, or there has ceased to be an identification with one to own that object. Action has its origin in the first cause, The embodiment of awareness is the product of the first cause and causal chain that gave rise to form that could observe the product of its will. Ignorance causes a perception of duality, and thus it creates meaning to the extent that potential or actual consequences create feelings. The Dhamma points to non-reaction by virtue of not perceiving to be anything that can own anything. This doesn't have to change the circumstances of life. The same work can carry on, in fact, in the face of an energetic awakening. There may be a desire to abandon the world, but responsibilities may dictate that adherence to a previous routine persists. But it's fully possible for a householder to be liberated. All the action can continue on the outside despite the lack of volatility on the inside. There's just doing of the tasks and allowing what happens inside to be felt without reference to ideas about a conceptual self. If most of your attention's engagement of another person is in the thought of them rather than in the presence of them, they may be believed to be more familiar than they actually are. The perception of an identity is augmented by the rumination on hypothetical scenarios. So you can more know your own idea of a person than the actual person, and then hold them responsible for those ideas you had that began and ended in your head. By the same token, if there is identification with what's perceived to be one's own thoughts, can you know anything besides the conceptual self? Know oneself. To know oneself is not to master knowledge of identities. It's not the knowledge of the fingerprint of identity, but rather to realize that the self is what's aware and not what it's aware of. Right view supports continued peace in a non-personalized view of unfolding phenomena. Spiritual practice of various kinds helps reshape the neural pathways. Keeping the mind one-pointed allows for the atrophy of memory. And since the conceptual self is memory, it begins to shrink in the absence of the energy that follows attention. It's like a dehydrating fruit. It starts to separate from its peel on the inside. It breaks away from the husk. When the conceptual self begins to shrink, there's kind of a perception of distance between awareness and what's perceived in that awareness. Meditation puts attention into non-relational things, things that don't have the hooks of identity, things that can't cause proliferation of thought, things that are neither good nor bad, just things that are. And the purpose is stillness. Those objects of attention can be classified from gross to subtle, and they can be engaged in that order to good effect.